So hello my friends, Devaun Lennox here, photography bond James.com. In today's video I want to talk about telephoto lenses. Note you can find timestamps in the description down below. You can also scrub through the video to skip to a more relevant section if you'd like. But with that said, let's get started. Have you ever wondered how photographers get such detailed up-close shots of wildlife or athletes on the field? Maybe they sneak in carefully when subjects aren't noticing, risking getting attacked or trampled. Well, of course not. They use a unique specialty tool known as the telephoto lens. But still, what exactly is a telephoto lens and how is it different from a standard or wide-angle lens? Also, how can you use one to affect or improve your photography? So let's explore what separates these lenses from others. Let's also cover their main advantages and disadvantages so that by the end of this video, you'll understand whether they're a worthy addition to your tool belt. So first and foremost, what exactly is a telephoto lens? Technically speaking, a telephoto lens has a longer focal length than its physical length or the diagonal size of the image it takes. It's also longer than normal lenses or those that approximate the human eye, which ranges between 35 and 58 millimeters. So technically any lens greater than 60 millimeters can be considered telephoto, even though many photographers disagree with that statement. And instead, most photographers agree that focal lengths above 70 millimeters on full frame are the start of telephoto, which we call medium telephoto specifically. From there, most would agree standard telephoto lenses start around 135 millimeters and continue to 300 millimeters. From there, you have super telephoto lenses, but I will touch on the categories of these lenses more specifically later in the video. Either way, these lenses also add a telephoto lens group, which stretches its light path, and that in turn reduces their angle of view, which is how much of a scene a lens captures. So now it ranges between 30 and 4 degrees rather than 50 and 63 degrees like a standard lens. Together, this allows these lenses to magnify distant objects, enlarging them and making them easier to photograph. They also add working distance to the subject, forcing you to stand further away, and they reduce the relative depth of field in your images, letting you capture photos with a creamy background blur and excellent subject separation. But quick commercial break. Did you know PhotographyPX launched a sister company called PXPresets.com? Well, if you didn't, PXPresets.com is going to be your next one-stop shop for Adobe Lightroom desktop and mobile presets. On PX Presets, you can find a large selection of presets to shortcut the process of getting high quality images and consistent branding across your imagery. We have a large selection of styles that are well suited for food, products, portraiture, fashion, beauty, and much more. We're also running a special right now for our mega collection. So if you want to upgrade your entire workflow in one fell swoop, now's a great opportunity. So if you're in the market for some high quality Lightroom presets to shortcut your workflow, feel free to check out pxpresets.com. With that said, back to the video. Now, I touched on the types or categories of telephoto lenses earlier. Let's talk about that in depth right now. Today's telephoto lenses are further divided into 3 categories. On screen is a chart with the most standard telephoto lenses, their angle of view, and their typical use case. I want to point out that these categories are highly debated and subjective. No one, as far as I found to date, has a set agreement on where these categories separate. So this graph is just our perspective here at PhotographyPX on the matter. That said, a short or medium telephoto lens is ultimately best for most photographers since it covers many of the common use cases of these lenses altogether, and it's unlikely you'll need a super telephoto lens unless you're specifically doing specialized mediums like long-range sports or wildlife. Now, let's talk about how a telephoto lens affects your images as a whole. First and foremost, it changes the angle of view. Since telephoto lenses have a longer focal length than normal, they have a smaller angle of view than other lenses, and that in turn means they capture less of the scene ahead. And this also explains why photographers have to be far away to frame a subject properly. Second, it affects your depth of field. Telephoto lenses also change the apparent depth of field in your photos, which decreases proportionally to the subject's distance. So unlike a wide-angle lens, which makes more of the scene ahead appear in focus, telephoto lenses have the opposite effect due to their high image magnification, and you'll want to physically move further away to maintain a similar depth of field. Otherwise, expect the depth of field to be more shallow when compared to other lenses at that same distance. Third, it changes our shooting perspective and the subject size. Since telephoto lenses have a high image magnification, they magnify distant objects to make them appear larger. So to compensate for this, most photographers end up moving further away to compose, but that added distance changes the apparent perspective in your images as well, and it compresses the perspective, reducing the relative distances between elements, making the foreground and background appear closer together or stacked on one another. That also makes the subject appear larger in the process than it would be in reality. However, these lenses have pin cushioning distortion, which also makes facial features appear closer together, which creates a slimming effect on the subject. So that combined with their foreshortening effect makes them more flattering for portraiture. That said, how do telephoto lenses affect the background specifically? As mentioned earlier, telephoto lenses compress the relative distances of background elements since you're standing further away, and that in turn reduces the sense of depth in your photo. In contrast, wide-angle lenses produce the opposite effect and exaggerate the sense of depth. Unfortunately, this change has an enormous impact on how viewers perceive your background. So as a rule of thumb, use a telephoto lens if you want the background elements in your photo to appear closer to the subject and you don't want to exaggerate their distance, or choose a telephoto lens to fill the background with less empty space. Telephoto lenses also make the background appear more blurred, and the bokeh effect with a 200mm lens at f2.8 is far more pronounced than a 35mm lens at f2.8. However, this phenomenon isn't caused by the lens itself, as some may think. Instead, this happens because these lenses have higher image magnification ratios, bringing background elements closer when you compensate for the distance. And that gives them the appearance of having more blur. The actual depth of field is the same between these lenses, but the bokeh looks more out of focus since it's larger on the telephoto lens. So if you want to accentuate a blurry background, a telephoto lens is perfect, even more so if you can compose tightly on the subject, since that will only make the effect more pronounced. Now, if you're curious what's the difference between a telephoto lens and a zoom lens, here's the key difference. The term telephoto refers to focal length measured in millimeters, and one that's longer than the lens itself, while the term zoom really means a lens with an adjustable focal length, or put another way, you can change how much of a scene it captures without having to physically move. Beginners get confused about these terms because most photographers end up referring to a telephoto lens as a way to say a lens is zoomed in, but that's just confusing. So think about it this way: telephoto lenses have a long focal lengths, usually above 70mm, and zoom lenses have a variable range of focal lengths. With that, not all zoom lenses are telephoto, for example, a 16 to 35mm lens, and not all telephoto lenses are zooms, for example, a 200mm f2.8 prime lens. Any lens can be one, the other, neither, or both, but I want to clarify these terms are not interchangeable. Now, with those areas covered though, what are the advantages of telephoto lenses? First, they help you focus on the details. Since these lenses have a narrow angle of view, they're ideal for capturing a small area of the scene and minor details, and they help you focus the viewer's attention to only the most essential elements within a scene, rather than just having everything get lost in a larger view. Next, they make subjects appear closer to the camera. Since they also have a narrow angle of view and high image magnification ratios, these lenses make your subject appear closer to the camera, and this is a key reason many photographers opt for these lenses, since you can take detailed photos of faraway subjects and get closer to the action. Next, they separate your subject. Since telephoto lenses naturally have a smaller depth of field, relatively, unless you compensate for that by moving, they're ideal for isolating a subject from a distracting background, and unlike a wide-angle lens, they make it easier to have subjects stand out without unwanted background detail. Next, they have a higher lens compression, and the compression on these lenses makes elements in the foreground, midground, and background seem stacked together, making photos look more proportionate. Next, they also flatter your subjects. Since they require you to move further away, that added distance plus their lens compression makes the subject's facial features appear smaller relative to the background, an effect called foreshortening. They also have pin cushioning distortion, which I mentioned earlier in the video, and together these factors slim the subject, making them look more proportional. That said, telephoto lenses are not perfect, and they have some noticeable downsides, which can be deal breakers for some photographers. Let's cover those now. First, they exaggerate camera shake. Camera shake is always a top concern in photography, but sadly with their larger image magnification ratios, telephoto lenses emphasize the appearance of camera shake, and settings that normally work for a wide-angle lens usually create motion blur with a telephoto lens, reducing sharpness and overall image quality. Not to mention these lenses are also quite heavy, only adding to that challenge. Next, low light photography with these lenses is a challenge. Due to their inherent larger size, it's rare to see these lenses offer an aperture below f2.8. Sadly, this combination with their proneness to camera shake makes them somewhat limited in low light photography. So unless you're willing to increase your ISO, it's best to use a tripod if you're planning to use this kind of lens at night. Next, their working distance isn't ideal in some situations. The narrow angle of view and high image magnification means you'll have to be quite far from a subject to frame them properly. If you're shooting outdoors, that's probably not a problem, but if you're indoors in a packed room, you may struggle to get enough working distance to frame your subject properly, and it could be a deal breaker. Next, their depth of field can be a challenge. The narrow angle of view and high magnification ratio also shrinks the apparent depth of field, and while that makes it easier to get a creamy background blur, a popular effect for portraits, it's hard to get everything in focus when you want it. Even narrow apertures like f13 or 16 can still be too shallow, and you can still struggle with these values, especially when you're shooting close to a subject. Lastly, their size and weight. It's also important to point out these lenses are quite heavy and they're usually uncomfortable to hold over long periods, and they're on the bulky side. But to conclude this video, telephoto lenses are an excellent option when you can't get physically close to your subject, and they're also great if you specifically want a more shallow apparent depth of field or the lens compression effects they offer. That said, they're not perfect and they're not a must-have for every photographer, but at least you now have a better understanding of how they work, their strengths, and whether they're a good suit for your workflow. Thank you for watching today's video. I hope you found the content of it valuable, insightful, and you learned something meaningful here. If you're new to our channel, please consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. If you have any comments, questions, or feel like I've overlooked something in the course of the video, please let me know down below. I've been your host, Devaun Lennox, Photography P. .com.